Don't you know, we're talking about a revolution. It sounds like a whisper. Don't you know, we're talking about a revolution. It sounds like a whisper. While they're standing in the welfare lines, crying at the doorsteps of those armies of salvation, wasting time in the unemployment lines, sitting around waiting for a promotion. Don't you know, talking about a revolution. It sounds whisper. Poor people gonna rise up, get their share. Poor people gonna rise up and take what's theirs. Don't you know you better run, 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 run. Oh, I said you better run, 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 run. 'Cause finally the tables are starting to turn, talking about the revolution. Yes, finally the tables are starting to turn, talking about a revolution. Oh no, talking about a revolution. Oh, while they're standing in the welfare lines, crying at the doorsteps of those armies of salvation, wasting time in the unemployment lines, sitting around waiting for a promotion. Don't you know, talking about a revolution. Sounds like a whisper.
Hello and welcome. My name is Alejandra Marchevsky, and I'm the chair of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Cal State LA. Thank you for coming to the closing forum of this year's Hess Scholar in Residence program, a conversation between Barbara Smith and Robin D.G. Kelley on bringing class back into intersectionality. Welcome and thank you to our esteemed speakers, Barbara Smith and Robin Kelley, and moderator Joseph Entin. Thanks to Brooklyn College's Wolf Institute for the Humanities for an epic week of programming, especially to its director, Gaston Alonso, and administrator, Kiana Benjamin. From my corner of California, muchas gracias to our department administrator, Lisette Rivera, Iris Chu, College of Arts and Letters, communication specialist, Owen Miller, college tech specialist, and my WGSS colleagues and students for trusting me with our collective voice. When Gaston Alonso and Jean Theo Harris at Brooklyn College invited our department to be the West Coast co-sponsor of 2 Hess events with Barbara Smith, my heart skipped more than a few beats. Like nearly every other person that spoke at last week's events, I first read the Combahee River Collective statement when I was in college, and it rocked my world. It was 1989, I was 19 years old, and Ronald Reagan had just left the White House. The Combahee statement had been written a decade earlier by Black socialist lesbian feminists. Like a canary in the coal mine, the collective foretold the human wreckage that was coming in the 1980s. A misogynoir politics that cast Black women as welfare queens and breeders of an unruly Black underclass. The GOP's marriage to Christian fundamentalism with its anti-abortion, anti-feminist, and anti-LGBT agenda. The politically produced AIDS crisis, the war on drugs, militarization of policing, and explosion of prisons, a surge in US imperialism from Central America to Afghanistan to Angola, attacks on unions and workers, and the systematic defunding of public schools, healthcare, and welfare programs. The deregulation of Wall Street, massive corporate tax breaks, a culture of competitive individualism, and extreme wealth accumulation. Not unlike today, the 1980s were a hot mess, a terrifying time. And for young people coming to political consciousness, the Combahee statement saved us from despair. Not unlike today, the collective, Black, female, queer, and socialist embodied everything that the right despises and that liberals barely tolerate. These fierce feminists gifted to emerging scholar activists like me a vocabulary to name the interconnected systems of domination that shape the material conditions of our lives. They charted a politics that springs from our personal truths and challenged us to think and act beyond ourselves. Combahee invited movement from self-love to collective militant organizing, from reforming broken systems to dismantling them and building a new world. Taking a cue from the enduring leftist slogan, "An injury to one is an injury to all," they modeled a more complex form of solidarity, teaching us not to mute our embodied identities, but to use identity as a bridge to other people in coalitional struggles for liberation. Somehow, Barbara Smith and her comrades found the courage, the boldness to publicly name themselves as socialists during the Cold War, when many leftists of color were assassinated, imprisoned, or forced into exile. When Combahee spelled out their anti-capitalist politics, they continued a tradition of Black radicalism, from Alabama's Black communists during the Great Depression, as documented in Robin Kelley's classic book, Hammer and Hoe, to Black radical women like Queen Mother Moore, Claudia Jones, Esther Cooper Jackson, and Lorraine Hansberry. They also called up non-Black socialist feminists, like two of my personal sheroes, Puerto Rican freedom fighter Lolita Lebron and Guatemalan union organizer Luisa Moreno. Today, however, class and capitalism too often are treated as an afterthought to intersectionality's trifecta of race, gender, and sexuality. Barbara Smith herself noted last week that people tend to cherry pick from the Combahee statement, choosing points that feel most affirming to them rather than seeing each piece of the manifesto as inseparable from the whole. In the US, where socialism has been a dirty word for over a century, the explicit anti-capitalist stance of the Combahee statement is often glossed over, including by people who celebrate the statement overall. Yet the need for class-based analysis and struggle is just as urgent to intersectional politics today as it was in 1977. Let me briefly offer an example of this. In 2021, just 2 years ago, the US maternal mortality rate rose by 40%, due in large part to COVID-19. The greatest jump was in African-American maternal deaths, which were 2.6 times greater than the rate for whites, and Native maternal deaths, which doubled in that year. Class inequality is an essential framework for understanding and therefore organizing to stop these gender and race health disparities. The New Poor People's Campaign has shown a direct correlation between a community's economic resources and its COVID-19 risk. People of color disproportionately live in the lowest income communities that have COVID death rates more than 2 times higher than high income communities. When we layer in pregnancy as a gender-based health risk, low-income Black and Native pregnant women, non-binary and trans folks and their infants face outsized precarity. To name class inequality is not enough. As the Combahee Collective argued, we must interrogate and dismantle political economic systems that place social groups in an equitable relationship to power, wealth, and health. Racial capitalism and cis heteropatriarchy are responsible for the concentration of women of color and queer and trans folks of color in work and housing conditions where they face greater exposure to COVID-19. These intersecting systems explain why women of color and LGBTQ people of color are more likely to be uninsured or underinsured, to have weak access to prenatal care and healthcare overall, why they are less likely to be able to take time off of work while pregnant or after giving birth, and so forth. An anti-capitalist analysis also leads us to question why, even before COVID-19, the United States had the highest maternal mortality rate of all industrialized nations. It requires naming and shaming the powerful capitalist actors that have blocked the creation of a universal healthcare system in the United States. It requires questioning why access to healthcare, and thus to wellness and life, exists in our society as a high-cost commodity rather than a common good. Not surprisingly, the mainstream media reported the boom in maternal deaths without any mention of class or capitalism. News outlets like the New York Times checked the box for intersectional reporting simply by mentioning higher maternal deaths among women of color. There's an acute danger of intersectionality functioning as a representational gesture. And by this, I mean the inclusion of women of color or queer or trans people of color for the appearance of diversity and the veneer of complexity. This is a neoliberal intersectionality, gutted of the radical politics and potentialities imagined by Barbara Smiths and other radical feminists of color. To use Alice Walker's metaphor for different types of feminism, today we are too often seeing the deployment of a lavender intersectionality rather than a deep purple one. And I'm hopeful that today's conversation will lead us back into the purple zone. With that, I want to pass the mic over to our moderator. Joseph Entin is a professor in the English department and the American Studies program at Brooklyn College and in the Liberal Studies program at the CUNY Graduate Center. He is the author of Sensational Modernism, Experimental Fiction and Photography in 30s America, and co-editor with Elizabeth Duclos-Oseo and Rebecca Hill of Teaching American Studies, State of the Classroom as the State of the Field, with Sarah Blair and Franny Noodleman of Remaking Reality, U.S. Documentary Culture After 1945, and with Bob Rosen and Leonard Vaught of A Radical Teacher Reader. His new book, Living Labor, Fiction, Film, and Precarious Work, coming out in 2023, explores contemporary narratives of low-wage labor, work, precarity, and migration. He has received the Claire Tao Distinguished Teacher Award, the Eric M. Steinberg College Citizenship Award, and a Whiting Award for Excellence in Teaching in the Humanities at Brooklyn College. He is co-founder of the Brooklyn College Listening Project. Welcome, Joseph.
Thank you, Alejandra, and thank you to everybody who's here. It's wonderful to see you. I'm glad we can all gather here. This is a very exciting evening for us at Brooklyn College. It's the culmination, the very last event of what is known as the Hess Scholar in Residence Week. Every year or two, the Wolf Institute for the Humanities at Brooklyn College is able, thanks to a gift from the family of Robert L. Hess, who was the 6th president of Brooklyn College, to bring an esteemed scholar, intellectual, activist to Brooklyn College for a week. And there's a whole series of events. And this year's Hess Scholar, Barbara Smith, has been incredible and was instrumental in organizing the events, which is highlighted by a public lecture that Barbara gave last Thursday night. And all of the events in this past week are available on the Wolf Institute's YouTube page, which you can find if you're interested in getting more Barbara Smith. That's a great way to do it. Recent Hess Scholars before Barbara have included Lisa Lowe, Winona LaDuke, and about 22 years ago, Robin D.G. Kelley, who's also here with us tonight. So this is like a double whammy for those of us from Brooklyn College at the Hess. We've got 2 Hess Scholars in one amazing event. So welcome to all of you. Before introducing the 2 of them and kicking off our conversation, I want to thank everybody at the Wolf Institute, the director, Gaston Alonso, and the administrator, Kiana Benjamin, as well as Rima Mills and Gabrielle White from the Wolf Institute board, everyone on the Hess Planning Committee and at Brooklyn College who helped make this week such a smashing success. And to give you a sense of how influential Barbara's presence was on campus, I'll just say that Sao Fong Ao from the Women's Center was passing out homemade buttons at that last Thursday's Hess lecture that asked, "What would Barbara Smith say?" And I've got mine right here. So is an indication of how inspiring your words, your actions, your commitments are to people who've had the chance to hear and engage you this past week, Barbara. After this visit, you are truly iconic at Brooklyn College. So congratulations and thank you so much for giving us so much of your time this week. One of the things that Barbara said this past week, which has stayed with me, was, we are all here because of struggle. And one thing that unites our 2 speakers this evening is their relationship to struggle. They are both activist intellectuals, thinkers who write about and also write to advance social struggles and movements for justice. Barbara Smith is an organizer, a movement builder, a writer, a scholar, and a publisher who has played a groundbreaking role in opening up a national cultural and political dialogue about the intersections of race, class, sexuality, and gender. Over the last 50 years, she's been active in several of the most important movement campaigns of our time for civil rights and women's rights, against war, against police brutality and other forms of state violence, against apartheid and imperialism, and for queer rights, human rights, environmental justice, and more. She is the author or editor of numerous landmark books, including, and I think she's got to win awards for most dynamic titles, including All the Women Are White, All the Men Are Black, but Some of Us Are Brave, Black Women's Studies from 1982, Homegirls, a Black feminist anthology from 1983, The Truth That Never Hurts, Writings on Race, Gender, and Freedom from 1998, and I Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, 40 Years of Movement Building with Barbara Smith, which received the Lambda Literary Award and the Publishing Triangle Award, and actually has a foreword by Robin Kelley. She was co-founder and publisher until 1995 of Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press, the first US publisher for women of color. And she currently lives in Albany, New York, and has also served 2 terms as a member of the Albany Common Council from 2006 to 2013. Robin D.G. Kelley is the Gary Nash Endowed Chair of US History at UCLA and a trailblazing scholar in several fields, including US and African American history, the study of the Black radical tradition, working class studies, jazz studies, and more. He's the author of a number of acclaimed books, from his path-breaking study Hammer and Hoe, Alabama Communists During the Great Depression, to his biography, Thelonious Monk, The Life and Times of an American Original, to Race Rebels, Culture, Politics, and the Black Working Class, and Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, which was recently reissued in a 20th anniversary edition. Came out in 2002, I believe. His essays appeared in a wide range of publications, including The Nation, The New York Times, and the Boston Review, for which he serves as a contributing editor. I also want to note that in the Academy, he is renowned for his generosity, especially his support of junior colleagues in letters, book reports, book blurbs, and more, as well as his tireless commitment to speak out and organize around critical political issues inside and outside the university, from current attempts to ban African American studies, to police violence, US interventions abroad, to the unionization of graduate students, justice for Palestine, and more. And as I mentioned earlier, in 2001, 2002, he was the Robert L. Hess Scholar in Residence at Brooklyn College. So welcome to the 2 of you, as well as everybody else. Finally, before kicking this off, a word about format. This event was conceived as a dialogue between Barbara and Robin, who've known each other for a long time, but I imagine they don't talk as often as they might like. And I have some questions that kind of spark the discussion, but of course, you 2 can take it wherever you like. You can ask each other questions. We'll follow you. At about 6:45 Eastern, between 6:45 and 7, we'll open the chat. People in attendance can submit questions too. So if a question comes to you while you're listening, if you're there in the audience, please jot it down and then post it so we can try and address it once the chat opens. Okay, here we go. This panel is about putting class back into intersectionality. This of course implies that somehow class is often not integrated into intersectional analysis. And Alejandra talked a little bit about this problem in her opening. But I thought we might start by sort of unpacking some of these ideas in terms, and perhaps the history a little bit, of the Combahee River Collective statement, which Alejandra, did a really great job of framing for us. The queer, feminist, anti-racist, socialist manifesto that Barbara co-wrote with your sister Beverly Smith and Demita Frazier in 1977. The Combahee statement is often considered a key document in the theory of intersectionality, although it uses some different words. It explains that oppressions are interlocking and experienced simultaneously. But Barbara, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about the CRC statement, when and why it was written, and the nature of its radical social and political critique, and the historical moment and context out of which it emerged and responded. And Robin, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your first encounter with it, what it meant to you then and what it still means to you now.
Thank you so much. And I'm so happy to be with everyone. Before we change views, I saw a lot of friends who I haven't necessarily been in contact with recently. So I'd love to capture who was on in the little pictures, and maybe we'll get to see that later so that I can send them emails to something to say how happy I am to see people, as I said, I've been connected with over a lifetime, and yet not necessarily in constant contact these days. So if that applies to you, know that I'm excited. I also want to thank Brooklyn College. Last week was one of the most incredible weeks of my life. And in my effort to try to figure out how great was it, I told Gaston Alonso, I told him, I said, maybe it compares to the first time I went to Paris. So it's way up there, way up there. And I also want to thank Professor Alejandra Marchevsky for your wonderful introduction, and also for co-sponsoring this event. And I'm so excited to be working with you, Joseph, and that's Professor Joseph Entin at Brooklyn College on our conversation this afternoon. You come up with really good questions. And so having said all of that, I will try to talk about the origins of Combahee. The Combahee River Collective statement was written in 1977. The Combahee River Collective started as a chapter of the National Black Feminist Organization, the Boston chapter of the National Black Feminist Organization in 1974. The reason that we wrote the Combahee River Collective statement, and I see, what should I say? I frequently see different versions of actual events that were not actually true. We wrote it because Zila Eisenstein asked us to write it. We didn't write it and then she found it and said, do you want to hand it to me and we'll put it in this book? No, the reason that we wrote the statement at all was because the wonderful anti-racist feminist scholar, abolitionist scholar, Zila Eisenstein was working on, I think, her first book. I think it was her first published book. And the name of the book is Capitalist Patriarchy and the Case for Socialist Feminism. And I have said in different conversations and in interviews, I don't know that we ever would have written a statement had she not asked, because we had plenty of other things to do that were not sitting down and writing a statement. We're activists. We were an activist organization. We were involved in sterilization abuse, Dr. Kenneth Edelin's trial for having done a legal abortion, and yet he was prosecuted for manslaughter, a Black OBGYN. No coincidence in Boston that that's who they prosecuted for doing a legal medical procedure. We worked on the Joanne Little case. We were working on many, many different things. And as I said, if not for Zila Eisenstein, we might likely never have written the statement or written it up to the level that we did, because we knew the book it was going into. Say a few years later, we say, well, maybe we should write something down to describe ourselves. But that's not the same as being in a book called Capitalist Patriarchy and the Case for Socialist Feminism, and really want to be able to get to whatever that phrase is. We wanted to measure up with our company, and so we did that. So that's the origin. Robin is muted.
So yeah, I'm ready. Do you want me to just jump in? Okay.
Go ahead.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
first of all, I just have to say, like, what you said, Barbara, about the Hess residency is exactly how I felt. And it's an amazing experience. And I turned 40 back then, and I got to play the piano with the band. That was a great thing. So I have to say that's important. The other thing I want to just clarify is that Barbara's the one who's iconic and has been iconic as long as I could breathe. I mean, you got to understand that. And one of the things in terms of my own journey, I have my own journey to the work, but we actually first met It was at the Black Radical Congress, and that was 1998. And I have to say, if anyone, I don't know if that was filmed, but you were in the plenary set, the opening plenary session, and one of the opening plenary sessions, and that was probably the bravest talk I'd ever seen anyone give, because you're surrounded by a lot of Black nationalists and a lot of Marxists who still happens today, but back then were not willing to hear the truth about the patriarchal politics, about the misogyny, about the failure of these movements that we all were celebrating as this big coalition, to really understand, even if that term wasn't used, the intersectional character of our struggle. And it was like a pin could drop. I mean, when you talk, I remember that because you were like, I'm going to have to tell the truth. And it was so powerful that even if someone in that room never read the statement, they couldn't have come out of it without being transformed. And I think that was the most dynamic moment in the whole history of the Black Radical Congress, if not the most dynamic moment in my own history of witnessing anything political, period. And I've seen a lot of things. I'm an old person now, right? I was young then.
Wait a minute. If you're old, what am I, ancient?
No, we're both. Look, I embrace my years and years, because I can now call myself like an elder kind of. But then one other thing I just want to mention about Barbara, people don't know. So after we met, I don't know if you remember this, but you used to call me on the phone and tell me about campaigns in Albany, tell me about what's going on. You were like a teacher. And that's back in the days when people used phones, like these were not cell phones. These were the phones that you plug in. And you used to talk to me on the phone. So that's the backdrop for what it meant for me, having come across the Combahee River Collective statement in All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but some of us are brave. And I found it in that text. The text had come out, I think it was 82. And I was in college and it was new. I was at Long Beach State and I remember seeing it, reading it, and thinking to myself, these are the politics that I not only identify with, but the only politics that could save us. There was nothing else. The statement covered all these struggles that we kept treating as separate. And just one last thing about the theme, what to me stood out above all wasn't the patriarchy, and it wasn't the race, it was the class analysis. It was that class was everywhere in the statement. And class, both in terms of what segment of Black women we are struggling for, what statement of the Black community, what segment, and also to incorporate what segment of a feminist movement. Like you can't, she said, they say you can't have a feminist movement if it's a truly radical feminist movement unless you address the question of class. And the fact that the statement uses the S word, socialists. It doesn't say we're socialists, meaning we're social democrats. It's we are socialists. So we can't forget that. That is the anchor for any left politics. Any radical politics is transformative. And it was always there. And since then, I give you a long list of people who try to reinvent the wheel. It's already there. We don't have to do anything else, right? So that's my experience as someone who's a budding communist who found the light in this book, from this statement, in a city that my father grew up in, ironically. So.
Well, that was so great. May I just say, I want to acknowledge what Robin just said and did. As soon as you said, I think that we met at, before you finished the sentence, I thought, oh, he's going to say Black Radical Congress. And I don't know why it, just gelled in my mind that's where, but it suddenly, I guess because we're talking kind of face to face, I think that's jarring my memory about, oh yeah, it was the Black Radical Congress. But I just want to say thank you for that. And yeah, it was there was a lot of stress, speaking as honestly as I did, because the people who were there were my icons. You know, Kathleen Cleaver, Angela Davis. I can't remember, you know, exactly who else, but I pointed out, I said, this is the first time that I have been asked to participate in something that I would, you know, describe as an intervention of the Black liberation struggle. It was the first time. And yet I'm age peers, pretty much. Both the people I mentioned, Kathleen Cleaver and Angela Davis, are a few years older than I am, but we're the same generation. And so it wasn't that I wasn't out there, you know, working. It was that, you know, by being an out lesbian, I was, of course, a persona non grata, as were all the other lesbians, gay men, queer people of every race, every gender presentation, etc. I mean, we were so ostracized within the context of even left movements at that time. And it was particularly painful in the context of the Black liberation struggle, because we've been Black all of our lives, and we were absolutely affected by white supremacy on a daily basis. Just like, you know, I'm waiting for it to stop. You know, I'm 76, but you know, it's same old, same old. It doesn't go away. And that's because it's systemic and also serves racial capitalism very well, to have an ideology that puts a certain people in a certain place based upon not their skin color. I hate that. Not their skin color. We're in a certain space and category because of our social status and our political position. So when people say, oh, you know, like the only reason that so-and-so wasn't allowed to do something was just because of their skin color. No, it wasn't. It was because they were identifiably people who had African heritage living in the United States, which marks you as being a person whose origins are in enslavement. So when you start as property, that's a long trajectory to get to human, you know, to a human status, and we're still fighting for our rights to this day. But as I said, it was really quite a moment. And what the point I was making is that being rejected, or to be rejected by our Black community, that was just completely hellish. That was the worst thing that could happen. So like to be invited, I actually worked on the organizing of the Congress. I didn't just show up for that. I had been working, you know, on the Black Radical Congress because Barbara Ransby wanted me to get involved, and of course I did. But the thing is that that was quite a moment. But you probably have other things you want us to talk about, Joseph.
No, absolutely not. You guys should, again, take over, please, if you want to. But I mean, the discussion about, you know, property, racial capitalism, you know, and Robin's point about the S word that, you know, appears in Combahee, the statement is very clear. It is expressly, explicitly socialist, anti-capitalist. And, you know, it's clear that these different axes of oppression cannot be disentangled, right? But as Alejandra mentioned, sometimes people do cherry pick their version of the Combahee River Collective, you know, that suits their needs. I mean, one of the things I noticed last week is you dropped a phrase in the conversation that we didn't hear very often, which was the ruling class, to remind people, I think, right, about, you know, part of the critique that is on offer in your own thinking. And in the statement, at one point, the statement says, we realize that the liberation of all oppressed peoples necessitates the destruction of the political, economic systems of capitalism and imperialism, as well as patriarchy. It's hard to read over that. But sometimes in left thinking, left organizing, class and intersectionality, like the premise of this conversation, has somehow become detached. And I wondered, you know, you are two scholars who've thought a lot about class, about capitalism, about racial capitalism. If you wanted to talk a little bit about sort of what class is, why it's hard to keep in the conversation, why over time it has tended to drop out on occasion.
Well, what I would say is that the level of class consciousness in the United States is very calculated. It's supposed to be the way that it is, because this is supposedly a place where anyone can succeed. Anyone can live the American dream. All you have to do is just try and work hard. And anyone can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But of course, there's a very, very big asterisk around all of those statements, unless you're a person of color, unless you're queer, unless you're a woman, unless you are living with a disability. I mean, unless you're an immigrant. I mean, there's all these, exceptions to that really mythology, the mythological dream of what U.S. society is. And so almost everyone in the United States, except for people who are principled leftists, I would say principled leftists, not just leftists, but except for people who are principled leftists, who are open, who want to learn more, who are not in it for the clicks or whatever, but who are just doing the work on a daily basis. Most people never have the opportunity to even figure out how class operates in a supposedly classless society. So that's a big challenge. If I had been able to speak last week at the Hess Memorial lecture about class, what I would have been sharing is that to this day, I'm confused about my own class background, but I do understand class politics. And I was very fortunate to be introduced to the major thinkers around those issues, actually as a junior in college, because I spent my junior year at the New School for Social Research. And we did a deep dive into all the great thinkers. And it was like young professors, not much older than ourselves. It was a program that they had started for people who were dissatisfied with their present college, wherever they were. And it was only a junior, senior year program. And when the first day of school, I was looking at people around me in the auditorium. Now, I was at Mount Holyoke, so I was not in a hotbed of radicalism. But the thing is that I would look around, I was looking around, I said, wow, these are people from Antioch, from Reed, from Berkeley, whatever. I said, these are some of those radical and dissatisfied people in the whole nation, because they didn't like those other places that I looked to as like, yeah, it'd be cool to go there. It'd be cool to go there. But in any event, that's when I got introduced to the major thinkers, and then continued to do that work when I returned to Mount Holyoke, because I was a sociology major. And so I learned about it from books. But before I learned about it from books, I learned about it from my objective circumstances in the world growing up. So I have to say that my family, I would describe them as working class / lower middle class. So we didn't suffer the way that some people suffered. We always had food to eat, including bacon. One of my favorites. We also, a friend of mine also said that Gabrielle Union, the wonderful Black actor, that in her book, she says that the way that when Gabrielle was growing up, that she knew that a Black family whose house she went to was rich is that they had Welch's grape juice as opposed to grape drink. And so we had Welch's grape juice. So I wrote back to my friend who told me, I said that settles it. We were very well off. We had the Welch's grape juice. But I can make light of almost anything apparently, but this is very serious. You can't understand what's going on in our society or in any other if you don't understand how capitalism works and how it puts people in positions to serve the needs of capitalism. And it does that very well by having, surplus labor pools that I learned about, a surplus labor pool of the people that you can bring in to the economy when you need their work and you need more people to do the work, and you can kick them out quickly when you have no longer a need for them. And of course, what we say is last hired, first fired. Last hired, first fired is a statement about capitalism, but it's a thing that Black people say, from time out of mind. I heard it when I was growing up. So as I said, my class consciousness comes from lived experience and also from being introduced to and very, very interested in an analysis of why are things so messed up here. because that was basically what I wanted to find out. Why are things so messed up here?
Well, we learned something, that the radical petty bourgeoisie always has Welch's, you know. That's
Oh
true.
dear. Oh dear. And that's all that I drank. That's really all that I drank is grape juice. Yeah.
That's funny. This is a side note, but my father's father, my grandfather, was a actually very prominent Baptist preacher in Boston. He was a pastor of St. John's Missionary Baptist Church. And of course, if you go to Baptist church, there's always grape juice, because that is the blood of Christ, right? Then I can give out wine.
Absolutely.
Right? So,
Absolutely.
And it was Welch's. So let me tell you.
It was Welch's. Yes.
So this is a really good question, and I think Barbara's answer was excellent. And I'm just going to add, come at it from a different angle, and that is that, we're living in a period, in fact, not just now, but even then in the 90s, when identity politics was pitched against class, that somehow bringing class is about, pushing identity politics off the table and putting the real thing, which is class. So and when you said principled left, I think that's so true, because I've spent half my life fighting leftists who all say they're my friends, and they're my friends, I guess. I'm friends with lots of people. And they're all, and many of them are taking this position that, class is real. All the other things are kind of a chimera. They're subordinate to, and that what we need to do is leave identity politics behind. So it just so happens that one of the first times, at least in a published piece, that I wrote about you, Barbara, and about Combahee River Collective, in the statement was in Your Mama's Dysfunctional, which came out in 1997, where I was battling. In fact, it was based on a conversation, a debate I had with Todd Gitlin and people like Michael Tomasky and others, who chose Combahee as an example of what's wrong with identity politics. It was the dumbest thing. I mean, the dumbest thing I've ever seen, where they break it down as if somehow what you're arguing, what the statement argues, is for a very narrow focus on the self. In other words, we're just interested in Black women, especially queer Black women, right? That's all we're interested in, and everything else could go. When in fact, it's the analysis that opens up windows into understanding exactly how capitalism works, exactly how gendered capitalism works, how racial capitalism works, and what does it mean to build not just a movement, but a new society in which liberation is much more expansive. So I had to fight them in the pages of Your Mama's Dysfunctional, and fight them also, because that's also a time when there was an organization called Sausage, which was an acronym for Scholars, Artists, and Writers for Social Justice, which was full of really great people, amazing folks who were supporting the labor movement. I was one of the few Black people who all the labor folks knew. So I was on everyone's Rolodex. Rolodex for the young people is sort of like what you put in your phone with names, right? And I remember at some of the early, our second meeting, Eric Alterman wrote this attack on me and on, oh God, how am I blanking on her name? Amazing scholar who wrote about Eleanor Roosevelt. Anyway, so we both gave these talks, and the attack was exactly on this, saying, because I had said we need to deal with anti-racism as class politics. We need to deal with gender oppression as class. In other words, if you're going to build a labor movement or support a labor movement in this day and age is one that's not even predominantly white male. And it's one that's dealing with a lot of questions about reproductive rights, about housing, about other forms of discrimination, occupational ceilings, and about generation. In other words, let's not build another movement full of people who are in their glory days at 50 and 60, when we got all these young people who are dynamic, ready to lead. And so Eric wrote this nasty piece in The Nation attacking me.
Blanche
I think it
Wiesen
was
Cook.
Blanche Wiesen Cook, right? It just came to me, Blanche Wiesen Cook, who also gave a beautiful dynamic talk. So my concern, and I guess for some of the people who are in the audience, is to really, you need to go back to the text and read it carefully and not get caught in the trap of saying we need to disband identity politics and embrace class in order to move forward. What I do think is true, and I think Barbara would agree, and I would love to hear your thoughts, because we kind of talked about this, that there's a way in which identity politics, the phrase, has been hijacked by those who actually are not interested in class at all, or not even, who have a very narrow understanding, who see identity politics less as an analysis and an understanding of social relations and power, and more as personal stakes. That is to say, my multiple identities lead me here, and this is why I feel this. This is why I do this. When that wasn't the point at all. So I think there's a way in which, if that's the definition of identity politics, of course, we could critique that and reject it. But it's worth going back to the original and understanding how fundamental the anti-capitalist critique was there. Because one last thing, if you look at the history, both Barbara's history, political history, I mean, there's not a single movement that she hasn't been a part of. Civil rights, reproductive justice, anti-war, police brutality, around questions of gender, sexuality, and discrimination, just trying to run political candidates, all those things are there in the work. And so the expression of identity politics is actually in the work itself. Like, it's in the work, and you could see that. And a lot of the people who are critiquing this idea of identity politics are the ones who actually haven't done that work, So I'll stop there. I know I talked too much.
Oh, no, that's not possible. You can't possibly talk too much. I think, well, Robin and I actually did a show that aired last week, Katie Halper's show, in which we basically had this conversation with somebody who is very opposed to identity politics, and that person is Norman Finkelstein. And he had never heard of the Combahee River Collective statement until we did the show. And to me, I hope that people understand that I'm not being in any way sarcastic or anything like that. I just want to say that it wasn't just a matter of he missed a citation. To me, it was not being involved in the politics of those movements where it comes up for a really long time. That is, that he wasn't involved over however many years in any political context in which people were saying, "Oh, have you read the Combahee River Collective statement? It's really interesting." And I want to mention a book for people. I don't know why I decided to use a password on my phone this weekend. For some reason, I decided to do that. Be that as it may. The name of the book that I wanted people to know about, everybody to know about, is a book called Remaking Radicalism, a grassroots documentary reader of the United States. And the dates are 1973 to 2001. And I want to cite the authors, but of course that's not on my little screen here. But in any event, one of the authors, I know two Emilys, that's why I'm confused. But one of the authors is Dan Berger, and the other one is Emily Hobson. The book came out a couple of years ago. I bought multiple copies of it to give to people. And one of the things that's really gratifying is that these two wonderful scholars, Dan Berger and Emily Hobson, they decided that they were going to put the Combahee River Collective statement. This is like a book that's almost 500 pages long. And the first document, and it's all documentary history, except for some pieces that they commissioned if they couldn't find a document that covered the particular subject matter. But the first article in the book is a Combahee River Collective statement, because they actually think that all the things that were going on, or many of the things that were going on, kind of not attributing that work to Combahee, but that they embodied the understandings and the analysis of Combahee. And the thing is, to me, that's like getting an Academy Award, to be the first article in a book that has like 85 articles in it. It's like, okay, that's nice. That's real nice. And they also write about it in the introduction. They explain why they did that. But the reason I bring that up, besides the fact that it's a book I think that all of you would find quite valuable, and when the chat opens, maybe I'll be able to put it into the chat. But the thing is that it also shows what certain people have missed. Now, Chris Parenti was on the Katie Halper show a couple of months ago now, and he was talking about identity politics in a very negative way too. And what he said is that when we talk about gender oppression, when we talk about transphobia, homophobia, racism, sexism, any of the other isms and other kinds of oppression that don't spring from specifically from economic oppression, what we're talking about is oppression, not exploitation. Exploitation because of economic, using people economically for your own purposes, which is what bosses and what capitalism does. And they don't care, if you die on the job, if you get brown lung or whatever, it doesn't make any difference because they're about one thing, which is making a profit. It is exploitation. We're all almost all of us are exploited as workers. I mean, we can't say that we're not because we're working under a system that wasn't designed for workers to have autonomy and survive. But as I said, to Chris Parenti's mind, everything else was a mere oppression. But exploitation, when we get to the level of exploitation, then we're really class exploitation, that is, then we're talking about something serious. So I immediately thought of like, what would be an example of like pure, if not pure, but like blatant sexism or misogyny that would have absolute material consequences and that to me would perfectly embody exploitation. And the example I came up with off the top of my head, and I'm talking to the screen, they can't hear me talking. But the thing is that what I came up with is like, what about a woman who works in a business, in an office type setting, whatever. It could be a factory type setting, and it could also be a farm type setting. But what happens to this woman is what happens to far too many. And she is raped on the job by somebody who works there too. Or she's sexually harassed to a degree that she feels like and understands she can no longer function in that workplace. So when the abuse happens, when she goes to the people who make the decisions, they basically dismiss her and they say, tough, that's how we do things. That's how we roll here. You're not important. We don't care that you were raped. We don't care what your boss said to you. We don't care how you were touched, et cetera, et cetera. We don't care how afraid you are to come to work. We don't care about how sick it's making you. And you're having physical symptoms as a result of being in something that is much more than a toxic work environment. So eventually then, or even suddenly, that woman leaves. She feels in order to survive on another level, not a material level, that is a financial level, she leaves. As a result of her leaving, her family loses income because of perhaps the repercussions on her well-being and mental health. She's either cannot find another job or she's not capable of working after having been raped at her job. So the family that she supports, including children, which the society says it loves, but actually does not, but the family that she supports then lose their housing. And even though as the years pass, she gets back to, and her family gets back to a little more slightly stable situation than they were. I'm so sorry, my printer is on. I hate machines. I don't know what they're doing to me, but be that as it may, I hope that didn't disturb you, but be that as it may, she never gets back to the position that she was in economically and on other levels that she was in before she was sexually exploited. So tell me that's not exploitation. But see, the problem is the people who are writing all this stuff never happens to them. It never happens to them, and they're distinctly uninterested in knowing the people to whom it does happen. They don't care. So that's where we are, and there's a lot of that going around. What's most disturbing about attacks on identity politics, intersectional politics, etc., are the attacks that come from the left. Because we expect the right wing to do that, but when people like the ones that both Robin and I have mentioned, when it's not possible for them to even grasp what somebody's saying, all they have to do is read the words. But they're so closed and so narrow in their experiences, they can't comprehend.
Yeah, I mean, that example is, I think, a really powerful instance of the way that Combahee would have us think about identity politics in terms of its material specificities, right? And the way that that's always connected to interlocking systems of oppression, right? I mean, our CUNY colleague, Ruthie Wilson-Gilmore, is sort of famous for saying that, capitalism requires inequality and racism and, enshrines it, right? As do other forms of oppression. Those things can't be untangled. I think we're going to open the chat. So if there are people who are here who have questions, please drop those in and we'll do that. One of the things that I've been struck by this week is the way in which Combahee has continued to be so important to so many people, right? Almost 50 years later. The way that it has really lived and has been taken up by generation after generation, which I think it speaks to the power of that as a volume, as a text. But it's amazing to me to think back that it was written in a moment that felt kind of, in my mind, feels kind of unradical, right? The cusp of the Reagan era, right? Leading into the 80s and 90s. But it did, Robin, you were saying, I encountered it in 1982 in the stacks, or whatever at Cal State, Long Beach. And it does help to ferment something, I think, it sounds like, and carry something through. What was it like for the two of you to try and be radicals in the 80s and 90s, which felt like, such an oppressive moment in, a sort of Cold War redux in American history?
Right. I didn't feel that. And part of it is because, I graduated from high school in 1980, so I'm a product of that moment. And keep in mind what's going on. Well, first of all, Barbara could speak about what's happening in the 70s. The 70s was a very hot period. I mean, I would say the 70s may even be more radical in some respects than the late 60s. I mean, I think we put 68 on a pedestal for obvious reasons, but a lot of things continued. And I think about the work that was really the late 70s, in fact, after the statement came out around the multiple killings of Black women, in the Boston, Roxbury area, so there's that, and that organizing work around lots of things. Of course, you could talk about this, the mayoral campaign, the police beating, all this stuff happening in Boston at the time. But for me, the early 80s was like the Greensboro massacre is 1979. Reagan, of course, was elected in 1980, but what's the response? The response is the creation of the National Black Independent Political Party, NBUF, National Black United Front, the 1983 March on Washington, the 20th anniversary of that, was a march led by Black people, and Coretta Scott King was one of the major figures organizing that march, who at the time, as we know from David Stein's important work, was at the forefront of fighting for full employment. Full employment legislation was late 70s. But still, that march, the slogans were jobs, peace, freedom, basically. They were calling for disarmament. They're calling for a living wage. They were fighting for an end to police violence. The Miami Rebellion was 1981. This was a very hot moment, I think, politically, and precisely because some of it was in response to a right-wing turn and to neoliberal policies and to the fact that we just elected, well, not we, but some people, about 30% of the country elected a president whose first job was to destroy a union, the PATCO union. you know, he was anti-labor, pro-capital, and had pushed forward policies that brought us deeper into poverty for those people who are already in poverty, you know? So the class dynamics of the early 80s led a lot of people like myself to join these sectarian organizations. I joined the Communist Workers' Party in 1984, and all these different organizations grew. Now, they weren't always in coordination, and it wasn't like it was a mass movement, but you'll be surprised just how militant and radical that moment was throughout the 80s. And if we measure a political moment by those in power, then we don't always see what kinds of possibilities were actually there on the ground, you know. And Barbara. Oh, muted, I think.
Yeah, you're still muted.
Okay, got it. I think I didn't know if my putting myself on mute, if I could get out of it on my own. Apparently I can't. But be that as it may, I was looking around because I put something in the chat about the book that I mentioned, and what's interesting about the book is that the dates that it covers are 1973 to 2001. That is, you know, Remaking Radicalism covers 1973 to 2001, and it, you know, demonstrates exactly, you know, what Robin is talking about, that it was a very vital time for movement building, and many of the ideas, some of the ideas that we think originated at a certain time period or just came into existence. People were talking about abolition. There's one fascinating article by a group of women, I think out in, they're definitely in California, and I think they're in the Bay Area, and they're doing prison solidarity work, working on mass incarceration, et cetera. But I think in a more hands-on way around the conditions in prisons, as opposed to, you know, the kind of superstructure around prisons. And in this article, in the book, Remaking Radicalism, these feminists, who I think are primarily lesbians, use the term abolition. And it's like the 70s. So that was just like fascinating to me. I didn't find it probably any more difficult than anyone else to be a radical in the 80s. Because I was a radical in the 60s. So, you know, I had some experience, and I was Black my entire life. So it wasn't so challenging. I do remember, I mean, we were despondent when Reagan was elected. And one of my few acts of vandalism in my life is that I was in the supermarket one day in the mid-1980s. I had moved to Albany from Brooklyn in 1984. And there was something like Time magazine or Newsweek magazine as I was waiting in the checkout line with Reagan's grinning face on it. And I took out, I always carry a pen with me. And I took out my pen and I crossed his face out, and I wrote something hired killer or something like that. I was so angry because the thing is that besides everything else, you know, on an international and global scale, he made sure as many queer people died as possible from AIDS. He made sure of that. And my friends were dying, and that was a part of a huge amount of anger, as well as all the stuff they were doing in Central America, you know, the complete disruption of people's revolutions during the 1980s as well. So like, it was always hard. But the thing is, with what we have had most recently, with the clown, you know, the dangerous clown that was in the White House, it makes people Ronald Reagan look like a statesman. I mean, it makes him look like, it's just like, it's all the way, you know, out there and all the way live nowadays. That's why it's so important for us to have these kinds of discussions, and also to continue to try to build movements. I think maybe this is switching going forward from the question that you asked, Joseph, but I think that the left is not as stable as we would like it to be, or as effective as we would like it to be. And I think that the right wing, they're chugging along big time. I was talking to someone about the fact that they are going after African-American studies, trans students, also women's studies, gender studies. They're going after it all, particularly in the state of Florida, and they're being quite successful at it. And this person said to me, this person's younger than I, probably in her late 30s, maybe early 40s. And she said, well, my grandfather, he would not have been surprised by this, because I was saying I found it kind of surprising that they could actually figure out a way to get rid of course content, that never occurred to me that could be a successful move. And like she was basically saying, because he was born in the 1930s and came up at a different era of Jim Crow, that he would not have been surprised. And I said, you're not understanding what I'm trying to get at. But I'm not talking about the fact that white supremacy is ongoing. What I'm talking about is that they have effectively figured out how to disrupt public education in the United States around content. So that's, there's a lot going on. And I think that we have to be alert and we have to keep working. We cannot actually make change if we watch from the sidelines. Not everybody likes to go to meetings. I mean, who does like to go to meetings? Although the Combahee River Collective meetings featured homemade food, music, and a lot of laughter. But anyway, there's that. But the thing is that you can't have change just because you think about it. You got to put some work in. You got to put in some work.
I've discovered every event I've been with you at, Barbara, there's a lot of laughter. That was one of the themes from last week for sure. So I think that there's something you're trying to tell us there about organizing and activism and the necessity for laughter. But I was gonna wondered if you both wanted to say a little bit more about the present and some of the signs for hope. Alejandra had asked in the chat, where do you see the most exciting intersectional anti-capitalist organizing happening today? And my sense is that both of you have some real optimism about what may be happening, despite the power of the right and, the consolidation of wealth in the hands of a few and the attacks on critical race theory and African-American studies. There are some things on the ground on the left that are good news. And I wondered if you want to talk about the kind of moment we're in, the conjuncture as you see it.
I hope Robin would speak to that.
Oh, okay. I could say a few things. Yeah, no, I think there's a lot going on, I think, on two levels. The organizational level, I think some of the struggles around abolition, both in terms of not just the carceral state, but the police state as a whole, has been an opening for other things. And I think it's pretty clear that those who identify themselves as abolitionists, for the most part, are anti-capitalists. And they take as their compass the Combahee River Collective, That's pretty clear. I mean, the fact that Kianga put together this book that has both the statement as well as interviews with, with the three authors of the text and the statement by Barbara Ransby. So there's all these different formations. I think there's a renewed labor movement right now in the sector that has been ignored. Fast food, service work, as you have this expansive precariat, that the part of the working class that's often considered to be unorganizable, though that's just a lie. And who's leading these movements, whether it's warehouse workers in Amazon or Chipotle, are mostly workers of color, a lot of women, women of color, lowest wage workers. There is, I think, a lot going on. But then we could talk about organizational stuff, but when I say the micro level, and I'd love to hear Barbara speak on this, I think there is a change in the culture of organizing, where, you know, you can't just walk into a room without being self-conscious of gender. You know, just something as basic as recognizing one's pronoun, which is a recognizing of people's wholeness and how important that is. Recognizing structures of leadership, you know, where you try to create balance, recognizing ways of speaking so that everyone has, you know, an opportunity to say something. So it's a kind of horizontalism, I think, that's shaping a lot of organizing. It's not just anarchists, you know. So I think there's some things that are really great, but at the same time, I don't have a lot of stock in hope. And I'm not a big hope person, you know. I leave that to Obama. I think we have to be determined, because for a lot of us, and then this goes back to the title of the wonderful text that Gloria Hull and Barbara and
Pat Bill Scott.
Exactly.
Pat Bill Scott, yeah.
Pat Hill, right, exactly. Pat Bill Scott put together, and that is, you know, some people don't have the choice because, as Audre Lorde talks about, you know, some of us, especially Black women, were never meant to survive in the first place. So imagine living in a life where you're faced with essentially genocide, let's be real, for centuries, and you keep being present. So what choice do you have if the option is complete abandonment and erasure, right? So like some people have the luxury to say, you know what, this is not working. I think I just go and, you know, play the stock market and, you know, move on an island somewhere. We don't have that choice, right? So that's what gives me strength, knowing that it's going to continue no matter what we do. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to take wrong roads. We're going to have certain internal divisions, but that doesn't stop us from moving forward. In fact, it should be the thing propelling us, because we're supposed to learn from these things, you know, as we're always learning. But no, but then again, sometimes you learn stuff and you realize it was there in the first place in 1977. So I'll stop there.
I would like to say that although I think that the left is not as solid as we would like it to be, and not as effective as we would like it to be, it is very busy. I become aware of new formations, issues being addressed, etc., almost like on a daily basis, because that's what I'm interested in. Like, you know, you're involved in one issue and then someone tells you about another group. And it was kind of like a couple of weeks ago, like I was finding out about some groups, and I can't even remember exactly what issues they were working on, but they are groups apparently of, you know, younger people. And they were, you know, they had figured out some strategies for dealing with particular problems. I was thinking, wow, we are working so hard, and by we I mean those of us who want to see a just system and a just society and justice across the board. Those of us who are on that side, we have been and we are working hard. What's difficult, I think, is that it's the messages of the right wing are so much more comprehensible to people in this nation, because the understanding of those messages has been prepared for by basically keeping people ignorant and feeding them lies. So, you know, like, so if somebody comes along and says some more lies that kind of conform with, you know, lies and attitudes and things that are deeply embedded, it's harder. Because what you were saying, Robin, earlier about people attacking the Combahee River Collective statement back in the 90s, it's like, these are mostly really brilliant people. Why can't they read the words that are on the page and figure out what the words are saying? And I think it's because even they, because these were people, you know, who were to the leftist center, even they had like taken in the hype of what the U.S. society is supposed to be. That when some Black women, who many of whom were lesbians, said, "This is what it's like for us," this is accurate for us. Can you hear this? They couldn't hear it. They absolutely could not hear it. And the thing about, you mentioned pronouns, people ridiculing the concept, white male leftists ridiculing the concept of being decent enough to call someone and to identify someone, but in the way that they identify themselves. That's not such a big thing, but they're so uncomfortable, what all this is and what this means. They make fun of it. What difference does it make what you call someone? It makes a hell of a lot of difference, particularly if you look at the suicide rates amongst people who are trans, and also the murder rates that people who are trans endure, particularly trans women of color. Yeah, it makes a big difference to be able to have your name correct in your documents and also in your day-to-day interactions. What they think is petty and not useful is what we know is important, because we live there. We know what it feels like to be erased. We know what it feels like to be under threat because of who we love, or just, multiple things. So yeah, it makes a difference to us, and we've been working really hard to try to get that information to everybody. And this evening is one, one example of that continued attempt.
Yeah, it's so important. And that's one of the ways, right, in which class is discourse sometimes gets weaponized to dismiss, right, those issues as somehow secondary, right, which is a real problem. Do you want to say a word about the Maurice Mitchell essay that you were mentioning in the chat, which is getting some love and affirmation? And somebody else had also asked about the Hamer-Baker plan. I think you wrote about in The Nation. And if you wanted to say a word about that.
Okay. I put first I put the name of the article, the title of the article in the chat, and then I was able to put the link in. The article is Building Resilient Organizations for Joy and Durable Power in a Time of Crisis. I put joy in all caps because I thought people might like to really see that's a part of what we're trying to do. And Robin, I think this is the new introduction for Freedom Dreams. You talk about a lot of organizing that younger people of color are doing. You and I haven't had a chance to discuss this, so I'll just raise it now, who are in that realm of self-care, of growing healthy food, of making a place in communities that have been ignored and overrun, that you actually uplift those kinds of interactions, mutual aid. I would love to hear more about that, because I'm not always sure that that's the way to go. But I thought, wow, well, if Robin thinks that this is important work to do, that I need to find out more. I need to, because I actually, I am a part of Robin's church, our synagogue or mosque. I don't know if you actually have a physical building where you hold your meetings and stuff. But the thing is, as far as I'm concerned, I'm on it and I'm with it, so that's how I feel about Robin. And so if Robin says that something is important, I just basically think, oh yes, it must be important. Anyway, the article, and that's why I put joy in all caps, to show that people who are doing political thinking actually are thinking about some of these other things. There was a question about spirituality in the chat that I've noticed as well, which kind of ties into that concept of joy and self-care, rest, etc. Maurice Mitchell, who is the executive director of the Working Families Party, wrote a really important article that was published late last year, and it was published simultaneously in 3 different movement publications so that it would get out to people. And I think it really has been seen and read by a number of people. There could always be more. What he's writing about is what's wrong with our movements. I think that his focus is primarily on funded organizing, not-for-profit organizing, but they do hold the ground, around a number of issues, like, for example, reproductive rights. So, a lot of the work around reproductive justice and reproductive rights is in the context of 501c3 organizations. And he really puts out a challenge to people. Basically, he's saying what my grandmother, used to say to my sister, Beverly, and me. She used to say to us, it's nice to be nice. That's what she would say to us. to try to get us to a certain standard, of behavior, it was encouraging. It was an encouraging comment, because I guess it was like, you can do this. You can actually be nice. It's nice to be nice, and you'll feel better for it. But he was trying to say that he was saying that in his article about enough with all the canceling, all the hostility, all the attacks, all the stopping of movement work because somebody misspoke, and you're canceling them, and you're going to have the whole work of your organization stop, just absolutely cease until you punish that person sufficiently for those mistakes. So I don't think I'm doing a great job of summarizing what it's about, but it is an article about where certain parts of our progressive and left movements are, what's hampering them, and what could be done to make them more functional. And to me, that is an encouraging sign. I thought that's why I wanted to share it. I wrote an article back in 2020. The first article I wrote was titled "The Problem is White Supremacy," and that was published in the Boston Globe. I started writing it shortly after George Floyd was lynched. I did not know what else to do. I don't really like writing. People hear me say that, they think I'm nuts, because there's certainly evidence to the contrary, but the thing is that it is a very hard thing to do. And but in that case, after George Floyd was annihilated, I just felt, what can I do except for write something to try to explain to people, this is what you just saw happen. This is why it happened. This is why it keeps on happening. And that article was published. I then went to the Nation, hoping that they might want to republish it. But fortunately, the editor there said, no, we would like you to write something new. And I had written in the first article, what if we had a plan on the scale of the Marshall Plan to eradicate white supremacy in the United States in a strategic way. It was like a work of fiction, the article that I wrote about the Hamer-Baker Plan, because there's no way it would ever happen under the present power structure. But I wanted people to start thinking about, what could we do to actually get rid of this scourge, which has overdetermined life in the United States ever since first contact being 1492. I mean, it was a thought experiment. And it's going to actually be republished in a book soon that I won't be able to say the title of correctly, but they're books that have been based upon and that have been inspired by Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. And they're doing, I think it's called People's Voices of the 21st Century. And that article about the Hamer-Baker Plan will be in there. And of course, you can easily find it online as well.
Right. If I could just add a couple of things, I just want to second what you said about Mo Mitchell's article, because it really is important. It was one of those lightning rods in a political culture, and I thought your summary was great, in a political culture where people were beating each other up rather than having grace. And, Mo's a veteran organizer, and as you know, Barbara, as a real veteran organizer, you have to have grace. If you're going to, you have to go to where people are and really embrace them, and then bring them along, because you bring yourself along too, and are transformed by it. And the other thing I just wanted to add, which is related, so Emily Hobson, who was a former student of mine at USC, her first book, Lavender and Red, is brilliant in that it's looking at, gay, lesbian, queer organizing. And she has this amazing chapter that deals with how, especially lesbian, but lesbian gay organizers were at the forefront of solidarity around Nicaragua and El Salvador. They were at the front lines. And this is what their politics brought them to, when a lot of people were not doing that work, and they did so as out lesbians, out gays, out queer organizers. And I think that's an important lesson, because you never know, what motivates one's politics. And in that period, anti-imperialism was a very important part of it. And sometimes we think we know what an anti-imperialist is, but And the same thing with anti-war activists. So overall, I think that we have these important historical lessons that affect us today. And so to go, and that's just my segue into the question about mutual aid. And I don't want to make the case that mutual aid is itself, in and of itself, a politics, but it's a very old strategy or practice, I should say, of finding ways for people to help each other, not for the purposes of replacing the state, not for the purposes of not making demands on what the state should provide, but it becomes a means of building solidarity and anticipating what a caring culture might look like. Because when you say, Barbara, about being nice, that is so true. I just find that people who have home training are usually, decent organizers.
Did you say they're usually decent organizers?
Yeah. They're good.
Oh yeah. Oh, then I should be a really good one because I had really good home training.
Exactly. Like you wouldn't go into a church to give a talk and look all raggedy, just
absolutely not
to push up against respectability politics. You know where you are, and this goes back to this question of mutual aid. And I learned this from Dean Spade. I learned this from my daughter, Kelley, and others, that it's the relationships that are built that allow for other kinds of struggles down the line. It's not a replacement. It's not a substitute. And the stories that I was telling, especially in the epilogue and the introduction to the new edition of Freedom Dreams, had to do with two different scenarios. One, Detroit, where there's all this amazing kind of working class self-activity taking place in high schools, in community gardens, in the attempts on the part of community organizers and the East Side Solutionaries, for example, to create their own energy grid. Again, not as a substitute, but to use the levers of municipal power as a way to try to see some kind of space and change the dynamics so people could have control over their own lives. And some of that's successful and it's happening. Even challenging police violence by figuring out ways to organize communities. I think about, the work that you all were doing in Boston around gendered violence and how that reflects some of the work in Washington, D.C. and the idea of the green light, as using the green light as a way of recognizing spaces that are safe spaces. And in many ways, in Detroit, they were figuring out ways to get elders involved in simply having chairs on their porch. So in this case, it's the chair, where you sit on the porch and watch as kids get out of school and just look out for them, so that they're not harassed by other kids, but also not harassed by the police, and it creates a safer space. So there's a lot of things that are happening that are not seen as political, but they're deeply political because they build relationships. And then the other place, of course, my sister lives in Jackson, Mississippi, where some of that work is being done. The only problem or challenge is that you have the progressive forces in power. And what it means to govern is a whole different thing. So on the one hand, they're trying to do things to provide jobs and work and provide housing and provide the things that people need against a state, the city of Jackson, a Black city, against a state that's trying to strip them of all power, strip them of a judiciary, strip them of police that they have control over, strip them of the revenue from the airport, strip them of everything to destroy this Black city, as they're trying to build something along the lines of a kind of miniature socialist city, right? It's hard because, and that's the lesson is that, we could dream all day long about what kind of world we want. And when you try to build it, you're building it against forces that don't want you to have that. because they lose revenue, they lose power, they lose capital. And so that is the struggle that we're always in. We could, it's not something that's easily winnable. And, to circle back to Mo Mitchell's article, he is dealing with organizations that are funded, but also raising the question about how do you get beyond that? How do we build autonomous organizations not so dependent on funders who are going to tell our organizations what they should do or measure success based on some kind of list of accomplishments or goals, right? As if they're mimicking the university that has reduced almost everything to like objectives and goals, not learning. So I don't know. That's a lot of rambling, but that's sort of how I see these relationships.
I'm so glad that you like Maurice Mitchell's article, aka Mo Mitchell. I think it took a lot of courage for him to actually confront the way that people have been conducting themselves in the context of movements. And I just, I love the fact that he did that. He actually sent it to me in manuscript, and because he used a quote of mine, and they were trying to verify the quote. So I was aware that this was coming out. I knew him. I had met him because of being involved in, some things that the Working Families Party is involved in as somebody who held office in Albany. But anyway, we could go on, but I think we're not supposed to, right?
You guys could go on and on. It's very clear. And I think the rest of us would be happy to sit here and listen for this to go on all night long. But, maybe that is a good place to wrap. I mean, around the question of autonomy and autonomous organizations, right? It makes me think about Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press, right? And Barbara, you have been doing that kind of work, that kind of organizing, that kind of thinking about questions of care, joy, alongside questions of economics, materiality, sexuality, gender. It's amazing when we think of that. We've been here for an hour and a half. We come back again to some of the things that you have been thinking about and enacting in your long career as, one of the most important activists and thinkers of our time. And, on behalf of Brooklyn College, I just want to thank you so much for this entire week. How grateful we have been. I will carry with me the idea that both of you mentioned of Brooklyn College as the Paris of Central Brooklyn. If only the governor of New York, Kathy Hochul, thought about it that way, that would be really wonderful. Our students certainly deserve it. And we were all fortunate to have you here this week, and Robin, to have you join us tonight. Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who showed up. So
before we get off, and thank you so
please.
much. I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I know how these Zooms can end very, very quickly. I want people to see what I'm wearing.
Yeah.
And like when we started, before we got people into the Zoom, like of course all you can see is my head, but I was so excited to wear my Black faculty sweatshirt that I was given on Thursday. And then I was saying, why did I think any more of me would be visible wearing the sweatshirt than ever is? Because it's magic. It's a magic sweatshirt. But be that as it may, I just wanted to stand up for a couple of seconds so people could see I'm all the way in with Brooklyn College. I so have enjoyed having this opportunity to be with you because this is our last public event of this cycle. But as has been made clear, the relationships and the connections that have happened are not going to fade, and it's we're just getting started. I'm just so excited. And yes, you are in that first time I saw Paris category. Because I used to live in Brooklyn. Wasn't the first time I was in Brooklyn, but it was just so wonderful. And I want to say thank you to everyone on campus who made this event happen, and also everyone who attended, and particularly want to thank you, Robin. It's so much fun to see you a couple of times,
I know,
without it being like years in between.
I know it's not going to be years. I'm going to see you in person soon enough. That just has to happen. And just on following what you just said, Barbara, I just wanted to thank, I didn't thank Alejandra and Jean, Theo Harris, and all the folks who helped put this together, and people I've known many years. And I have to say, the smartest thing that Brooklyn College has ever done, and the Hess people, is to bring Barbara Smith as the Hess Scholar in Residence. It sets a precedent, that, and now it's like, there's only one Hess Scholar, and that's Barbara. The rest of us are just like Hess wannabes. You know what I'm saying?
So you're saying you're chopped liver, and
I'm chopped tofu because I'm.
So what am I? Let's see. What's my favorite thing? I'm a shrimp taco, because I ate shrimp tacos all last week, and yeah, they were pretty good.
That's great. But thank you so much. And I'm gonna watch. I missed the lecture, so I'm gonna watch it. Eventually. But the one thing I regret is not being there for the whole week and being able to see you. But next time we got to bring you to UCLA to be like the super Regents scholars. We're going to bring you at the Regents lecture, which Angela did. So we're going to do that.
Does that mean I have to write something? Does that mean I have to write something?
You don't have to write anything. All you have to do is be you.
I actually felt good about writing it after it was done. Thank you so much, everybody.
Yes, thank you.
Yep. Thank you all. And thanks everybody for coming tonight.
Thanks. Thank you.